We are going to tell you about what makes this a fun and interesting data challenge that we hope you'll join us to help solve. We're going to tell you a little bit about the project itself and what we're trying to achieve. And then we'll just really describe for you what the opportunity is for you to become involved and what volunteering for this project might look like. We're going to leave some time at the end for questions, but as well, if you have any questions throughout, Corinne kindly has offered to monitor the chat for us, and we'll answer them as we go. And if you have any questions at the end, we'll cover we'll have a little bit of time at the end as well. Okay, so I guess it makes sense to start with me. So I am Jody Wolf, and my pronouns are she, her. My role at PolicyWise is a manager of research and policy, and I've been with the organization for just a little over a year. My background is in applied social psychology, and I say that I really come by my interest in community data initiatives through osmosis more than by training, although I do have some quantitative background. It's mostly been through my work with the University of Alberta, where I was a research manager there for about 10 years, specializing in addictions and mental health. And then I spent about 7 years at 6 or 7 years at United Way in Calgary before coming over to PolicyWise. Natalie, can I ask you to introduce yourself next?
Sure. Yes. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Really impressive group, number one. I'm really happy to be here. My role at Not In My City, I'm actually a consultant, and I've been working with Not In My City for just over 3 years now. So I manage programs, and I have been deeply involved in developing national and local provincial partnerships in a number of sectors, as well as leading key change initiatives, which we would call at Not In My City, which I'll talk about a little bit more about who we are later, sort of systems change. So I have been working 20 odd years in change and transformation. I myself am an applied researcher as well, and I am a professional project manager and a professional change manager. So having worked in a number of sectors and industries, the kind of work that I have focused on are pretty large strategic initiatives, whether they're technology-based or business transformations, bringing people together. And I like to think I do a decent job in bringing stakeholders and their needs together so that we design things for the community by the community, is what I've been saying for this project. So we partnered with PolicyWise for the purposes of their expertise. And it's been a really fruitful relationship to put the community at the center of this, as we would call it, user-centered design. And excited to be working with a group like Data for Good to bring our ideas. And frankly, I think we're creating a new path here. We're treading new territory. And so I really hope that we'll encourage and excite some of you to join us along for this new journey. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. And the real brains behind the operation, Marin.
Oh, thanks for that, Jody. Yeah, my name's Marin Severson Mason. My pronouns are she, her. I'm up in Edmonton on Treaty 6. I work at PolicyWise as a data management analyst. I've been with the organization for about 5 months, which have flown by. It's a real fun time. I'm trying to figure out ways to talk about this role in short descriptions. But I think it's a big part of the role has really been about trying to help organizations make better sense of their data, trying to help us make better sense of the data we have access to with our projects, and really thinking about the kind of social and human sides of data, and kind of a bit of a data broker role, maybe there's more behind that, but my background is I have a Bachelor of Arts in Human Geography and Sociology, where I focused on data analytics, kind of social statistics, social data, and then I'm also been working on my master's in sociology, again with a focus on social data and social statistics. So this is I'm really excited to be here. I work in R primarily. but always fun. Yeah, really love the thing about the human sides of data. So this is an important project to think about that.
Thanks, Maren. Before we dig into what this data problem looks like, we think it's really important to give you a bit of a broader context. So I'll turn it over to Natalie to tell us a little bit more about what this, how this initiative fits into kind of the larger Not in My City initiative.
Yeah, so for those of you that don't know who Not in My City is, I imagine many of you don't, unless you've bumped into the organization. We're an anti-human trafficking organization based in Calgary. It was kicked off by Paul Brandt and his wife Liz in 2017. Prior to that, Paul and Liz had done quite a bit of work in the anti-trafficking initiatives overseas, and really involved in some pretty intense work, especially in Cambodia. They turned their attention back to Canada, having learned about the issue and its prevalence, just its actual existence in Canada, and started to work and bring a team together to help build some momentum and awareness about the issue in our own city and in our own country. We've made some great progress with the strategic directions that we had laid out for ourselves over the past 5 years. The real focus is to raise awareness and collective action to prevent, disrupt, and end child sexual exploitation and sex trafficking in Calgary. So you'll see that youth is certainly the focus of Not in My City. This project, though, expands beyond just youth and child exploitation. I think what's important to know about us, for those of you familiar with the not-for-profit sector, is that we're a facilitative organization. So some would call us a backbone organization, that we're not on the front lines, we're not doing frontline work. We help support the frontline agencies by creating networks of best practice, projects that bring collaborative partners together to solve systems issues. So we look for the gaps in the systems that the frontline agencies don't necessarily have the capacity, the bandwidth, or the funding to do. And so we're looking for those opportunities. And this project is one of those opportunities that we saw that needed to be addressed in some way. And we put a grant forward in order to, which I'll talk about after, but a grant forward and got the grant in order to try to address the issue of data and the prevalence of human trafficking in Canada, or in Alberta to start.
Thanks so much for that. So you might have got the sense from Natalie's description that Not in My City is a real collaborator at heart, and that's the way that they had approached involving PolicyWise as well. So I'll tell you a little bit about PolicyWise too. We are a nonprofit organization, and our mandate is to connect people with evidence. So we are strong believers, and it's at the heart of who we are to try to inform, identify, and promote effective social policy and practice to improve the well-being, particularly of children, youth, families, and communities. It's a pretty broad mandate, actually, but at the heart of that is the work that we try to do with nonprofits and with government partners and collaboratives of all shapes and sizes to bring evaluation, research, and data analytics to try to improve the way that they're making decisions every day. And so a stream of that work involves community data initiatives, much like the one that we're talking to you about today. So I hope this gives you a good sense of who PolicyWise is and the way that we work as well. Over to you, Maren.
Awesome. So we'll kind of continue with the kind of stage setting, I guess, and bring it into the kind of fun, chat about the data. We thought it was important to kind of talk a little bit about what human trafficking is and kind of give a sense of the definitions and what the data is going to kind of mean. So in Alberta, Alberta has adopted a definition of human trafficking in the Protecting Survivors of Human Trafficking Act, which you can see here on the side, and I won't read the whole thing. But there are really three key parts to this definition that we can see here, and that's the act, or what is happening. You see that in the recruitment, transportation, transfer, that first line there. The second key part is the means, or the how. They're those methods used to recruit and traffic folks. And then the purpose, or the why, which includes sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, trafficking in organs. And there are a variety of definitions used around the world, used in Canada. Some of these include the called the UN Palermo Protocol, and Canada has a slightly different definition, and the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act has a slightly different definition, but they all broadly have these kind of three main components. But that's still pretty kind of big scope to think about those three, that kind of definition and those three parts. And we wanted to highlight a few kind of other key aspects about human trafficking. And not that these are the only kind of key aspects of human trafficking, but they have particular implications in the data and in the data challenge that we're going to discuss more. So one of the kind of key things as well is that human trafficking is both a crime and a human rights violation. And in these two different kind of conceptualizations, it suggests kind of the involvement of different organizations, different actors, and suggests also different programs and interventions. So considering human trafficking as a crime really involves law enforcement and kind of law enforcement type responses around prosecution, prevention, diversion, whereas considering human trafficking as a human rights violation really thinks about more kind of social service agencies and social justice agencies and supporting folks whose rights have been violated. And it's not a either or, it's just that considering that there's a whole realm and kind of the ways that human trafficking is conceptualized and who is implicated in involving and supporting victims of human trafficking. It's also complex and multidimensional, as we saw in that definition. So it involves both domestic or kind of internal trafficking within a country, as well as international trafficking and across international borders. It involves labor trafficking and sex trafficking and different types of trafficking, which have different kind of drivers and patterns as well. And then there's also both the kind of supply side and the kind of considering the victims and survivors of trafficking, but also the demand side and the traffickers and networks and industries that are involved in trafficking. Human trafficking is also distinct from other kind of complex and related phenomenon, and this is shaped though culturally, historically, politically, and so this has and can change over time. So human trafficking is distinct from kind of human smuggling or migrant smuggling, which typically involves more consent around that movement of people, as well as can be seen as distinct from sex work, but this is also culturally and politically and socially shaped. And then the other key aspect of human trafficking, which has particular data implications, is that human trafficking is hidden. So it's kind of a characteristic hidden population where the kind of population boundaries are not known. So it's very difficult to kind of sample for a survey, and they're not likely to show up in censuses. But they're also difficult. The victims and survivors are difficult to access and reach. Traffickers have an incentive to keep folks hidden, which also means that they're less likely to be showing up kind of in administrative or registered data. You're not going to see them in health data as potentially or in vital statistics. And so that kind of what's called the kind of dark figure, that figure of the number of folks who are not captured kind of in any data source, is thought to be bigger for human trafficking victims than for other hidden populations for these reasons, and that they're kept more hidden. They, for various reasons, face more barriers to reporting to law enforcement, face complex trauma. And the kind of result of that is, a hidden population, and that lack of data about hidden populations creates hidden problems, which makes it harder to design program and policy interventions to support humans. And that's the other kind of underlying aspect of all of this, is that there are humans at the center of this who are impacted by human trafficking. So considering all of that, I hope to start to see why there would be a data challenge, which is what Jody's going to speak to more next.
Great. So you can imagine in hearing all of that, that in addition to being a human rights violation, in addition to it having or representing a legal problem and a policy challenge, it is also a real data challenge in a lot of different ways. So a hidden population that intersects with the criminal justice system means that only the data the data that is currently available to us to track this issue is limited to police crime data. So right now, really only the only data that we have access to around this phenomena is police reported crime. And we know that that is an underrepresentation of how big this problem is in not just in Alberta or in Canada, but internationally. This is a problem that all jurisdictions have faced in terms of getting a handle on the size of this problem. Police reported crime data is an underrepresentation because not all parts of the population are equally likely to come into contact with police. So not only do we just have an overall kind of, we're missing a lot of people, we are not missing those people evenly across the problem. There are certain segments of human trafficking that in particular don't show up in that police crime data. Additionally, the reported crime data that we have access to is insufficient in other kinds of ways. It misses a lot of people. So we find out about the number of cases that have made it into these crime data, but we don't know as much about the victims or survivors of this phenomenon. We don't have characteristics or qualities of those victims represented in that data. We don't know much about the networks or mechanisms by which they have become victims of human trafficking. We don't know very much at all about the characteristics of the traffickers themselves or those who are paying for those services. We don't know very much about the industries that might be supporting human trafficking in various ways, because that doesn't show up in the uniform crime reporting data as well. Finally, the geographies and organizations that might be interacting with victims of human trafficking or the phenomenon of human trafficking are also not captured in the data that we typically rely on to produce counts of the scale of the problem in Canada. So the last few ways that that this is really a challenge in terms of the data is that the organizations that we want to work with around this really vary in terms of their data capacity, their data literacy, and access challenges. And this is particularly true in nonprofits where resourcing is often a difficult problem to overcome in terms of being able to use data very effectively. There's also a significant amount of time spent on manual data work and funder accountability that kind of absorbs how much attention they might be able to pay to data and analysis of that data. And finally, capacity is key to collecting better data and making better data-informed decisions. But we don't necessarily see a lot of that at scale in the nonprofit sector right now. So there are both kind of issues related to the data itself, what we have access to, as well as some of the challenges that we face in terms of the organizations that might be able to provide other insights into this problem. So I'm going to throw it back to Natalie now to talk a little bit more about what this project is all about, what we're trying to accomplish together, and to give you a bit of a better sense of where we are in the process.
Thanks, Jody. I'll just wait for the next slide. There we go. I'll just give you sort of a rundown at sort of the highest level here about the project. Last year in April, Not in My City was awarded a 2-year Civil Society Fund grant. Some of you might be familiar with it. It comes from the Community and Social Services Ministry. And so we got to work doing our initial planning last year and consulted with the community of anti-human trafficking sector in the province and related. And that is a body or entity that's informal at this point, which is the Provincial Human Trafficking Network. And so from that group, we worked with them to establish a working group, which helped us refine the project scope and what might be feasible. We conducted the first level of an environmental scan and literature review to start to look around locally in North America as well as globally as to what solutions had been accomplished and what work had been accomplished in the past. We did this with the community in mind and did a current state survey as well with all of them to ask them, what are their capabilities today? What are their thoughts about trying to solve this problem? How it might benefit them? And the whole goal of that first phase of the project was really to figure out, was it worth continuing on? Frankly, if we didn't think that it was feasible, or we ended up in a situation where we developed some technology that nobody found useful, we didn't think that would be successful. So we would have, closed up shop and moved on to something else. But what we found is almost a unanimous feeling around the need for better data, for better intelligence to understand the trends beyond organizational boundaries. So today, the organizations are, in a diverse and varied state of data gathering and reporting. But there was a need and vision to collaborate together to understand this issue better. The other thing that, so anyhow, we moved on to the next phase of the project, which is the design and development phase. And here we partnered with PolicyWise and hopefully yourselves to continue on developing a prototype solution that Jody will talk a bit more about. So really the goal of this project is to understand the prevalence, understand the scale, just understand the context of human trafficking better within the provincial boundaries to begin with, although some are already connecting us to what we could do nationally. So the opportunity on this project to prove out something that nobody that we have found so far successfully has done in Canada or North America in a similar way, the opportunities to influence other jurisdictions is quite great. And we know that we are on a data journey here. I wanted to come back to something that now I forget what I was going to talk about. It doesn't matter. I think I'll leave it there to let Jody into the next phase. What I do want to say is that the majority of this project we are spending understanding stakeholder needs. This has been a highly engaged project to develop relationships, to develop trust. Sharing of data and collaborating with data is not a common behavior or action within the sector, and not because it's a conscious choice. Most of the time it's because each individual organization is just doing their best to be on the front lines and to secure funding to do the work that they're doing. So we are, the opportunity in front of us to do something different is quite enormous and a big change for many parts of the sector. So I just wanted to lay a bit of that groundwork as well as to where we are in this project and what we aim to accomplish. We think is quite different than what we've found so far in the anti-trafficking movement.
Thanks, Natalie. One of the things that I want to point out, and just to add on to what Natalie has described there, is that this is maybe a little bit of a different project than some that you might see. Many times I'm sure that projects come to you with an organization that already has a data set sitting in front of them, and maybe they're trying to figure out what to do with that. In this case, Natalie and her colleagues have done an incredible amount of work to build interest and engagement and support for this project to begin with, and did really quite extensive work beforehand to figure out even what was potentially possible for this work. And so we wouldn't be where we are without incredible amount of work beforehand. And the other thing that I just want to mention is, I sort of joke that Maren is the brains behind the operation, but Natalie is really the heart behind this operation. And that's because she takes a really special focus and approach to the work that is both collaborative and person-centered. And that's something that we're really hoping to carry through with the rest of this work as well. So just to, I guess, capture what it is that we are trying to do in all of this, and as Natalie mentioned, this is a journey. And so a big piece of the work that PolicyWise is helping to support is the development of a roadmap that will tell us, well, where are we starting from and what might be possible in 5 years or 10 years down the road, and what might those stops along the way look like. And also what would need to be true in order for us to be able to make those stops along the way. But we don't want to just plan out, a big, dreamy roadmap of what might be possible. We really want to get started with something tangible right now. And as Natalie mentioned, there was consensus among the collaborative of organizations involved with Not in My City to go ahead and try something. And so what we are, what's right in front of us right now is the development of a prototype. And so when I say that we don't yet have a data set in front of us, that's because part of the first phase of this work was to reach out to organizations that go beyond police services and start to look at who else might have data that could start to tell other pieces of this story. So we've done some work and interviews with folks to get a better handle on which organizations have what kind of data and what might be possible with that data. What might they be interested in knowing about that data, what would be useful and valuable to them, and what might need to happen in order for us to have access to that data. So we're still in the process of kind of pulling that information together, and that's part of the next phases of this work before we expect to kind of get to that place where we have some data in front of us to work with. So I think I'll pass it back over to Maren at this point to kind of start getting into the nitty-gritty of what we're imagining for this prototype.
Awesome. Yeah, that's we're going down the funnel, so getting to the more specifics now. But just to add to Jody's point about the kind of, so we don't have that data set yet, but what we're really hoping to do is include some of those red boxes, and this is kind of that very much a simplification, but a way that we've been trying to kind of conceptualize the data that's kind of out there. And a lot of other methods have focused on trying to figure out that blue box, which is that dark figure, that kind of subset of the kind of victims of human trafficking that are not known to any system. And there's some statistical methods you can use to do that. And as Jody said, what we're hoping to do is to bring together the law enforcement, kind of the subset from law enforcement data that doesn't get into that kind of publicly, officially reported crime statistics, and those victims who are known to social serving agencies who would not be included in that crime data, and bring that together to show a different story about human trafficking. So as Natalie had mentioned, we have done kind of as this part of the kind of project, we've been really focused on trying to understand the kind of stakeholders and user needs and where the sector's at. And we've been doing a literature review and a key exemplar scan and stakeholder interviews, and it's been great fun. And I just wanted to pull out kind of a few key items here, which is that we've learned so far, which is that kind of talking about this concept of the human trafficking ecosystem, in talking with with organizations about how they see themselves as connected to human trafficking, and that data about the sector and how they describe themselves is an outcome in and of itself, and something that was not included on that other slide I showed with the different boxes, but is something that could be included as a type of data about the human trafficking sector and experience. There's also very significant variability in data maturity and organizational data practices across the kind of human trafficking sector, which really has implications for the types of data that are available and how it's collected, how it's counted. And then the other thing, as Jody was just also mentioning, is that organizations, when we were asking them what they're interested in, they were really interested in these sort of descriptive and analytical questions around where is human trafficking happening? What are the risk factors for human trafficking? But they weren't really interested very much in those questions about how many. And so suggests that focus on that kind of blue figure, showing that kind of dark figure, is not both not kind of feasible right now based on the data practices, but also not desirable. And this is also kind of changes what the prototype could look like, and thinking about some really creative ideas there. So one of the key outcomes kind of from this phase of work, and I was getting to these principles and implications for design. And these principles are really intended, they're really kind of value statements, not a list of kind of user needs or technical kind of specifications, but really very much around identifying things that are important and that we're trying to kind of center as we make decisions about the design and development of the prototype and of the roadmap, and some of those corresponding kind of implications, thinking really practically. So this document and these principles will be made available as part of the help guide the volunteers in this journey as well. But just wanted to kind of highlight some of them here, kind of give a sample of the ways that we're thinking and some of the things that are coming up. So for example, one of the principles around data equity and ethics, folks are really, we heard from the interviews, and we saw very much in the literature this focus on really taking an equity-based approach to data visualizations, as opposed to that kind of deficit-based approach, which centers on kind of differences and can reinforce negative stereotypes and stigma. And so kind of implication of that is that data visualizations and statistics really need to take an equity-based approach in this project. And that includes thinking differently about labels, thinking differently about colors, maybe using, jitter plots rather than a bar graph to, really thinking kind of creatively, but also very intentionally there. Another implication is that we heard really strongly around data security and controlled access, and knowing that victims of human trafficking are a very vulnerable group, and wanting to really ensure that we're minimizing any possible risks of harm and that the data is not getting into the wrong hands. And so having a prototype, kind of the information architecture for this prototype, really needs to be secure and support controlled access for both data contributors and users. So this document will be made available, but just want to kind of give some color as the sorts of things that we're thinking about to help guide some decision making. So having kind of thought, given that kind of setting the stage, kind of what's the data challenge, why it's important, where we're at kind of so far with the project, we want to talk a little bit more about what the opportunity is and where we're really hoping that we can, you can share your expertise, your knowledge, your skills, and your creativity with this project. So there's kind of three bodies of work. The first is around data governance and helping us really support respectful and ethical and secure data sharing and use standards. The second area is really that information architecture and kind of supporting with the processes to securely receive and transfer data, as well as the data infrastructure where this prototype is going to be hosted, where the underlying data will be stored. And then the third kind of key bucket of work is around the design and development of the prototype itself, and that kind of user, the user interface and the kind of outward facing side of things. So I will jump through and kind of discuss them a little bit more in detail. So for data governance, as mentioned, really that kind of this body of kind of work, really thinking through those data use and data sharing standards. And kind of data contributors all have their own policies and rules that these sharing and use standards are going to have to follow, as well as the kind of broader framework. And so some helpful skills that we thought of in this area, but also open to creativity and your thoughts. This is not in any way kind of an exclusive list, but some thoughts we had here, around privacy legislation, governance and data management standards, kind of risk, security, privacy, compliance, and requirements. Having some expertise and thoughts in that area would probably be helpful with this body of work. The second body kind of bucket of work is mentioning around that information architecture. So really supporting us, kind of really supporting with the kind of data pipeline and, kind of ETL type work, but on a smaller, not smaller scale, but with kind of different types of data, and really considering that data variability and the different data practices that our contributing organizations have, and really making this user friendly and secure. So some possible things that we thought of that could maybe work with, think about ArcHub or the Social Data Collaboratory at the UC, also your ideas. And some possible helpful skills around here include data engineering, data wrangling, cloud architecture, your ideas here as well. And then the kind of third body of work or bucket of work is in the design and development of the kind of prototype itself, as I was mentioning. This is really an opportunity to be creative and think about possibilities about what to do with sparse data, what to do with data that is going to be very variable. It can't be integrated at this point in time. And so some things that we've thought about, could it be might be analytics, it might be a dashboard, it might be a story map, it might be an infographic. And this is also where we're really looking for your creativity and your ideas. So some possible skills here that might be helpful. Think about statistics, think about data visualization. I like this, I heard this term about the analytic translation, which is really thinking about extracting meaning from using data, visuals, and narrative, kind of that whole bucket of things. And all of these kind of, so this kind of three related, but some slight distinctions between these three buckets of work where we would love your thoughts and input and expertise. And I know I'm just checking the time. It's gone by very quickly. So just wanted to kind of note a few, as you kind of help you keep thinking, kind of maybe making this more concrete. These are just some possible kind of prototype design examples that we've come across in our key kind of exemplar scan. So the one in the top left is a Tableau dashboard using Edmonton homelessness, using the HMIS system up in Edmonton, similar to if you've been working with Calgary Homeless Foundation in Calgary, you'd be very familiar with this similar type of data with an integrated kind of database system. The one in the top right is a more narrative kind of analysis about redlining in the US. It's using an ArcGIS story map. It's a really interesting, kind of cool, but very different style. And then the third figure, and I can go back to these after, is a static kind of data visualization and infographic from the United Nations High Commission on Refugees about mixed movement profiling. So this is just to kind of give some thoughts that have been floating around, some different things that could be possible. And then again, as we're kind of thinking more about thinking more concretely, as we're mentioning kind of the types of data that might be available, there could be some organizational level data, about the types of organizations in the sector, the services provided, as we're mentioning that kind of aggregate data on possible human trafficking victims from both frontline agencies and from law enforcement agencies. But we don't know about the kind of how detailed that will be, if we'll have kind of sociodemographic information or historical data. And again, really thinking creatively about about what to do with kind of sparse data, really variable data that has some that will need its own interpretation. So that I will pass it back to Jody now to talk about next steps.
Thanks, Maren. So as we mentioned, we can see a bunch of different ways that you might be able to be involved. And so to tell you a little bit about the timeline for this, in the next few months between now and the end of the calendar year, we'll be engaging in some design workshops with some of the potential users of this prototype, as well as the contributors, the data owners. We'll be doing some consultations with them to start to unpack what our data sharing agreements will need to look like, and to discuss their data, what data they have available in more detail, so that we can understand what we would have access to, how many years of data we might be able to obtain from different organizations, and the kind of technical side of what it would take to actually pull that data out of their systems and get it into something that we could use. So all of that kind of leads to this preparation and understanding a little bit more about how this is all going to come together. So we are really anticipating that volunteers would be most useful in the January to March timeframe. This is where we are really starting to kind of take the data that we will have available to us and start working with it. And we're anticipating that we'll be able to do this in a kind of an iterative sort of format where we might mock some things up, test out the data, see what's possible, and then get some reactions to it and some feedback from our partners in this process. And along the way, we're going to be kind of building out that roadmap. So, sometimes we anticipate that we'll come across a great idea that we might have that perhaps our partners aren't quite ready for, but we could imagine it being possible and useful and viable down the line. And so we'll, be squirreling away those great ideas and forming out that roadmap. Now, there is a possibility that the project may be extended a little bit, but we're really trying to work towards that March kind of deadline in case that extension doesn't come through, and just to kind of keep us all on track along the way. For those who might have some interest in that kind of data governance side of the work that Maren was mentioning, we would certainly invite you to join us kind of earlier on while we're having some of those conversations about the data sharing agreements and what all of that governance side of things might look like, because that certainly will be taking shape a little bit more towards the end of this year. But as I said, I think the bulk of the volunteer hours would be coming forward in January to March. Okay, so I think you would probably have gotten a sense that this process is still developing to some extent. We're really trying to be responsive to our partners. And so that means that, we're planning a few months ahead, but there's still some unknowns in this project, and we're kind of figuring those out as we can. We anticipate that there will be non-disclosure and confidentiality agreements that will need to be developed for this project. Part of the conversations that we'll be having with the data contributors in particular will shape what those agreements look like. And finally, one of the real values of this project has been in trying to bring as many minds and as many different kinds of approaches to try to solve this tricky problem. And Natalie probably says that in a much better way, and I'm missing your words right now, but she always has a great way of kind of framing that this is a problem that others have tried to tackle and have struggled with. And so we need the best and the brightest minds coming from different angles to really try to make some headway on this. So your creativity and your ideas are really welcome. We don't have a strict frame that we're operating from. Your thinking, the experiences that you have will be just as valuable as ours. So I think that it provides a bit of a unique opportunity for you to kind of stretch those creative thinking powers as well. So a couple of other things that I can mention. There is an expression of interest form, and I believe that link is either in the chat already, or it might be shortly if it hasn't been put there already. I also just wanted to take a moment to plug the fact that PolicyWise is soon to be hiring another data management analyst to join our team. We have lots of projects like this one that are getting underway. And so if you're interested in the kind of work that PolicyWise does, or want to know more about what that position might look like, I would be happy to talk with you about that after the fact. And please look out for that posting and see if it might be of interest to you or someone you know. So with that, I think we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jody, Maren, and Natalie for the great presentation. And yes, as Jody mentioned, we've put the expression of interest form in the chat. So feel free to save the link and fill it out to express your interest in Not My City. And yeah, I think these next few months will really be a great chance for us to onboard everyone, form our team, help out as much as we can with the design, and then just come out strong right out of the gate for the bulk of the implementation work starting in January.
So if anybody has a question, they can raise their hand or they can put the question into the chat. I have one question, short question, because we have another question just came in, is whether you've also thought about, as you're collecting data, whether you can come up with some standard regular data, like pick lists, for example, that you could share with the various agencies, that if you can get them using the same lists, the same ways of describing situations or types of trafficking, that it would be easier to join up different data sources after the fact because there would be some common data elements.
That's a great suggestion, Corinne. And maybe I'll just throw it over to Natalie, because I know that this has been something that has come up for her and has been something that she's been talking about with her colleagues for a little bit now.
Yeah, great question. And there's actually some research and some best practice about common data variables when it comes to human trafficking. We have talked to some of the stakeholders about it, and there is some agreement to work towards that. I think the simplest one that you just pointed out is the type of human trafficking. And so these are the kinds of standards that I think as a community we could easily land on. The other ones, each of them are taking demographic information. There would be some, negotiating there around how to find some common ground in that respect. Information about the victim survivor, their context, all of those kinds of things. I think these kinds of data variables there's a possibility to reach some commonality. And Jody talked about the workshops and the work that's ahead of us. And I think we're going to bring that back to the table for them to work through. Some are going to be much harder. The other thing that I was going to say about the data journey is the community has envisioned a future that is a much more advanced future than where they are today. And I think that's incredibly promising. And so this really truly is the first stage of a data journey. And so I think the opportunity here as well, engaging in this project, is helping the sector itself develop some data literacy and competency that they currently they currently don't equally have. And I know that, you know, PolicyWise's vision, as well as what Data for Good's vision, it's such a great match and a great opportunity to help make data useful and valuable in the day-to-day work, which will have a direct and indirect impact on victims and survivors.
Terrific. Sounds like you've given it quite a bit of thought already.
And I see that Eugene has asked a really, really interesting question. Thank you for that question. He asked, outside of the legitimate concerns about identifiability, why should the prototype or data not be made public? Maren, I know you've given a lot of thought to that. Maybe I'll throw that question to you first.
Yeah, it's a great, it is a great question. And, you know, as you think about like open data and wanting to support kind of, you know, reuse and seeing data go farther. But one of the big things that really came out in the engagement and in the kind of environmental scan was a real concern with misuse, and considering that this is really kind of the as Natalie was saying, like this is really kind of a big first step in the data journey, is really wanting to protect the folks whose data is about and ensuring that it's not getting into the wrong hands and couldn't be potentially misused. And so I think that's you know, thinking about the future could be some great, you know, thinking about how to expand it and what parts become public. I think are all kind of future thinking. But at this point, it's not just concerns about identifiability, but concerns about other external kind of actors and influences and where else it might go.
Mm-hmm. And if I can just add to that, Maren did a great job of answering that. I think the other thing is we're equipping the sector with the data. So it may be their decision to make the information public in ways that they feel are appropriate. So again, those are questions that we need to address with them. But to Maren's point, the culture of data collaboration and sharing is in its infancy. And so the step to you know, a publicly available product is quite a leap. And so we're definitely at the very beginning of using data in different ways.
Mm-hmm. And just to add to that as well, there might be aspects of this phenomenon that, you know, could or should be made public, and that's something that we might consider. So when we were talking about understanding the ecosystem and really helping to describe who are the players, who are the supports, and where are they located, and understanding where might be some gaps, that would be probably an area of data that would be perfectly safe and appropriate to share more publicly, or at least have less access restrictions to. So I think there are elements of this that are. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we had spoken to our law enforcement partners, for example, about some of the kind of details of where crime is happening, where human trafficking cases are coming from, and where they might be going to. And they had really legitimate concerns about whether or not the intelligence that they would be gathering from that might help them to direct resources to where they might serve a preventive function. But making that information public might end up actually pushing the problem into other areas and sort of, allowing those perpetrators to keep ahead of them. And so that could be problematic in terms of their effectiveness in law enforcement. So we really have to be careful about thinking what purpose does making it public serve, who is served by that, and who needs to be protected, and what are the potentially unintended consequences of making the information public before we decide, what would be visible to whom and under what circumstances. So I see that someone else's, Daniel here, has asked a question. Has there been any discussion around how this conflicts with the crime counting approach law enforcement have for hidden crimes, i.e. Increasing numbers of hidden crimes are usually seen as a good thing as it moves us closer to quantifying accurately? Another really great question. Yeah, I think that, there are aspects of the prevention side of this problem and the intentions that many have. When you raise awareness about a problem, which is certainly something that's within the mandate of Not in My City and partners who want to make people more aware that this is a concern in their communities and that it might look different than what they expect, so that people can be a little bit more aware and cautious when they're getting into potentially risky situations. That awareness building can actually inflate the number of people who come forward and seek help. And so, you really have to pay attention to whether or not those trends over time reflect genuine increases in the problem, or whether or not they reflect greater awareness or comfort, as we've seen in the Me Too era, of people coming forward and seeking help and kind of normalizing that, or whether or not it's downward trends might reflect pushing further into kind of darker sections of society, and that might actually be more problematic than if it was more visible. So I think there's lots of nuance to be considered there, and it's why it's so important for us to be working with partners closely on the interpretations of the data and understanding the context in which those trends are happening. Kristen, I see you have a question too.
Yeah, so my question might fall a little bit outside the scope of this particular project, but I'm still curious. So this project is kind of dealing with the data that is available, cases that have been recorded. And I'm just curious if there's been any sort of consideration of looking into aspects that might influence someone to actually report something. Because my neighbor is a nurse at Foothills Emergency Room, and she has told me, no specifics, of course, but about all the cases she sees that come in that never see the light of day, that are never reported. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm just curious, because it's great to work with the data that we can work with, mm-hmm. if that helps anyone. But mm-hmm. yeah, I was just curious if there's been any sort of looking into that aspect as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the things that really piqued our curiosity and interest in working with the community service providers, because we know that they likely will come into contact with folks who will never, who might never identify themselves as a human trafficking victim. So it's not a label that they connect with or kind of attach to themselves, or they might not at that particular stage in their healing journey. So, that's one aspect of people who, would never make their way to asking for help from police services. It might also be that they first reach out to social services before kind of getting to that place where they eventually feel like they might be comfortable with pressing charges or kind of proceeding in a judicial kind of way. To your point, really understanding who isn't counted in the law enforcement was, a main driver in us trying to figure out who else we might be partners with. And what we found so far is that there are certainly some forms of data that are held by community partners. It's often difficult for us to know exactly how many of those, might I say, community participants or clients of community services have had judicial contact as well. So we kind of can't necessarily always parse out exactly if they're in one database but not in the other. But that certainly there are folks who we would want to kind of capture or represent in this data in some way, but we need to be careful about how we tell that story, because it isn't always clear exactly who is a case and who is not, or where they might be found and where they haven't been found yet. So yeah, lots of subtleties, but it's I mean, on the one hand, it's really heartening to know that that other folks are able to identify people, and that people are able to seek help in many different ways throughout the system, but definitely makes the challenge of where to find that data and how to understand it a little bit harder.
Yeah. If I can just add to that, because it is for your interest's sake, and I think just to add some context to what you've talked to your neighbor about, is that I think Jody and I heard in the interviews, and I've heard this over time working with our partners, is that as high as 18 times it takes a victim to actually leave a trafficking situation. And so Maren showed a chart with the boxes and what we're aiming to count. And I think some additional context and why this is such a challenging data problem, sort of to the points that Jody was making, is that individuals will enter and exit in different stages of change. And so what your neighbor may be experiencing is the first incident of being in a hospital. I was just at a conference the other day and listening to two survivors and their journeys, and how many times they actually had to visit a hospital and they weren't detected. And even if they were detected and offered help, they wouldn't have taken the help at that point, because they weren't at a certain stage of their own change and transformation to transition to an exit strategy. And even if they were, they may have entered into a program or even have reported it to police and then left and not to be seen again for another year, having re-entered the trafficking situation and then having to re-exit. And so this happens over and over again, and they can show up in many of those green boxes on the second last line. And what is also heartening, to use Jody's word, to hear, is that they are recognizing the issue. As a side, what groups like us and Not in My City aim to do is raise the awareness and education of those practitioners, so that they have some tools as well as ways of directing individuals to possible exit strategies. But again, they're not guaranteed, and like we said, it could take up to 18 times for a complete exit from the situation, and many years.
Aileen has asked if the only way to report is to go to police services right now, or if there are other anonymous ways to report that you may be a victim of human trafficking, like an app. It's really interesting that you asked that question, Aileen, because there is a model in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, where they have attempted to try to provide a mechanism for putting into a centralized database cases that might be, I guess, come forward through other community services. So like churches or other social services in the community. And so that's a different approach that they have taken to try to get a bit of a better handle on the number of people who might be affected. And then a second way that this issue is kind of being handled in Texas is a kind of a centralized case management system. And much like the way the homelessness data is centralized through one organizing body here, any organization that wants to receive funding around supporting victims of human trafficking kind of has to sign on to this centralized system. And that, has provided a different kind of mechanism than what's available here. I don't think that there's an appetite for heading in that direction in Alberta at this time. But it does, go to show, Aileen, that there are, other jurisdictions are attempting to solve these issues in different kinds of ways. And, you know, something like an anonymous way of reporting or of identifying themselves and seeking help might be really valuable.
If I can add as well, if you wanted to look into it, there's a product that was launched. I don't know the effectiveness of it in the United States, called the Stop app. It was partnered with IBM, and it is on the lines of this secure anonymous reporting app. I really don't know how much momentum it got. I think it requires a pretty integrated service delivery on the back end in order for it to be effective. The other thing I'll say is that we equipped 211 Alberta in 2021 in January to recognize the indicators of human trafficking when individuals call about maybe something else, seeking services for being unhomed, you know, food, domestic violence. We've trained them with special training that comes out of the Polaris group in the United States, which runs the national hotline, and who also provided the training for the national hotline in Canada. And since we provided that training to 211 Alberta, they've seen a doubling of coded human trafficking calls. So they have, you know, some of the more complete data set that this project will have access to. And so they actually code human trafficking suspected and or confirmed calls, and then the kinds of services that were referred. So that's another thing that we've done, and we raise awareness about, so that people know that that service is available to them.
Oscar, I'm mindful of time, and just wanted to make sure that I left enough time at the end for you to cover off any wrap-up items that you had on your agenda, or?
No, we're good. If all of you are still good, then yeah, we can keep answering questions. Or if not, you put down your email earlier, so maybe people can email you directly.
Yeah. Any other remaining questions that we can answer for you?
I think Rob C had one there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I can, I see. Yeah, Rob asking a really good question about, so the data not being able to be integrated. And so a big part of that is, so when I was kind of setting the stage at the beginning, and I gave that kind of definition, and then I talked about how, there's that definition, but then there's all these other kind of conceptual and practical aspects. And part of that is that we see that in this data here, is that folks are using different definitions. Folks have different understandings of how somebody is identified as a human trafficking victim or survivor. Some folks are identifying it based on a list of indicators. Some folks are doing it based on other forms. And so the human side of the data is reflected in the data, and that it's going to be different and reflect those human aspects of how the data gets entered, how it's understood, and what it means, and how it can be interpreted. And so potentially in the future, depending on, as Natalie was talking about how these conversations have been happening around some different indicators and having some common variables and things like that could be integrated. But at this point in time, they can't be. So on the data quality side, part of that is going to come also back to our partners as well, and working with them, and to understand the term we've been kind of using is, or that I've been using, is like at the data biography, rather than kind of the metadata, but trying to understand those aspects of who entered it, how did it get entered, how did this come to be identified in this way, what definition are you using, because that will then shape what we can know for the kind of quality analysis, and then how it can be interpreted and framed. So really human, I guess, is the kind of, it's very much about the human side of the data.
I see Eugene had a question as well. I mean, I can answer that quickly. We haven't. There's, I mean, Jody mentioned the Netherlands. The Texas is a different example. No one has solved this problem in the way that we're thinking about it. I think this image that Marin's put on the screen that she created is a really good way of our way of articulating what it is we are aiming to accomplish differently than what other groups have. And other groups have the same challenge where the police reported incidents are the most quantified incidents. And what this project takes is the collaboration of a community. And this project would not be possible to move to this stage if we didn't actually have the provincial network to champion and to start to think together. And so unless the jurisdiction has an entity or entities that are facilitating these shared community of practice, you're starting really from, there's a lack of conversation, which makes the project even more difficult. And so as jurisdictions go, Ontario is doing some really good work in some of the larger communities, as well as there is some work arising in British Columbia. But I think the foundations of a project like this require a network in the sector to be able to work together and start to come to some common terms and standards around what it is they collect and what that looks like. So this is why we don't see the perfect solution out there to emulate. And as Jody alluded to, the Texas solution, amazing group, but they've gone down a very different data journey with that's tied to funding, that's tied to the governor's office. That's it's a very robust system that they have down there, and we're far from that. These are great questions. I'm so impressed.
All right. Well, I know that based on my age, I am getting close to my bedtime. I'm sure many of you have had a full day of work, and I really appreciate that you took the time out of your evening to come and join us and talk to us about this. And I hope we have spiked your curiosity enough that you might express some interest in coming to work with us as a volunteer on this work. But if not, if there's other ways that we can stay in touch, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. And yeah, I hope I have a chance to work with some of you.
Yeah, I've already seeing some expressions of interest coming through. So that speaks to the great presentation the three of you gave. So thank you so much, Jody, Marin, Natalie, for the great presentation, and kudos to everyone for the great questions. Mm-hmm. Very well thought out and great answers by the group. We'll be posting the recording of the presentation on the Meetup comments, and also we'll post the expression of interest link again in case some of you missed it. But yeah, you can look out for those in the coming days. But yeah, thank you so much everyone for joining us tonight, and have a good night.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Take care.